Sounds good. All right. Yeah. So again, talking about the first case study for the Hawaii Zoning Atlas. So we did some usability testing where we discovered that the current design had low system usability score. And essentially that's just giving users tasks to complete on the map. And then after they complete the task, we ask them a variety of questions. And from that, we get numbers that we then calculate to get the system usability score. And there's like a scale of what's acceptable and not. And then again, also just looking at accessibility issues. This was mainly having to do with the map colors, but also contrast for the text, and also looking at the responsiveness of the app on mobile. And so, yeah, the challenge that we were working with was for this case study specifically was just improving the usability and accessibility on the mobile app. And yeah, give it off to Wilcox.
So before we could figure out how to improve the map, we wanted to look at who our users are and what are their needs that we need to fulfill. And what we extrapolated in the beginning was that it seemed like the map was designed for zoning experts. It takes some pretty high level knowledge of zoning to understand the map. From the users we had interviewed, there's a lot of confusion around that. And so the users we really wanted to serve, and as a group, were ordinary folks who maybe are homeowners, small business owners, and of course, socioeconomically disadvantaged people who are being served by the organizations we're trying to partner with. And that was really the group that we wanted to hone in on, since that's where we can have the most impact as an organization. And so in order to figure out who our users are in UX, we come up with personas. So we'll take all the people we interview, synthesize them down into a couple different people. And since it's easier to understand people on a person-to-person basis, we give them names and backstories and take all of their pain points and issues and needs and synthesize them into folks. So the people we created were Becky, who is a 70-year-old grandmother who needs to build a tiny home for her grandson to live in. Rent's expensive, and so she wants to know if she can build an ADU so he can come and live in her backyard. So she needs a map that's intuitive, accessible, easy to navigate. She doesn't have a computer, so she needs to access it on her phone, which is a little difficult on the current map. Accessibility considerations we want to look at are that she has poor eyesight, she does use the phone instead of a computer, and she needs easy to click on icon size in clickable area. And Kaimana represents the group of people who are working for these activist organizations like the Hawaii Housing Alliance. And he needs a map that he can adjust parameters with to look at different patterns between zoning laws and civic services that are available in certain areas. And so he is colorblind. We mentioned the colorblindness issue earlier, so we really want to address that and treat that. So he represents the colorblind group of people, and he needs to also access this map on a mobile screen. So we created a couple user flows for each. Becky is going to use the map to find her specific house. So she'll filter it down using the zoning filters, look up what an ADU is, see if that will fulfill the needs of her tiny home that she's going to build for her grandson or would like to build. And then Kaimana is going to look, instead of at the filters, we'll look at the map layers and draw patterns and conclusions from that. And so how might we make a map that satisfies both Becky's and Kamana's needs? Becky needs something that is being filtered down, whereas Kamana needs something that has layers that can be added. And so in the prototype you see to the left, we have a filters button and maps button that we hope to address each of their needs, where Becky needs that property focus and Kamana has the regional focus. And back to you, Luani.
Yeah, so our next challenge was to think of ways that we can make the map more accessible. And so, again, with usability testing, we had users complete a task, and there were a lot of things that we noticed. The first was that users didn't notice that there even was a search bar. It was pretty small, and it wasn't in a place where people were expecting it to be. We also noticed that we tested with a colorblind person and they couldn't really determine the difference between the purples in the map. And we also tested against accessibility standards, and that's where we saw some issues with the text. And lastly, we also saw that users were a little bit confused on like what colors were associated with which layers since there wasn't really a legend yet. And so our solution for this was to create accessibility through customization. And so the idea here is that you'd be able to edit the map colors and textures and transparency. And so to improve the map's usability, so when again we were testing with people, we noticed that they were confused on the logic of the legend. And so we wanted to use interface elements that were more clear on what the filters meant. So switches for turning on and off, and then radios for filtering mutually exclusive elements, also checkboxes for mutually inclusive elements. We also saw that users weren't really reading through the instructions in the beginning. A lot of people were just like clicking through till the end, but then when they got to the map, they didn't really know how to use it, and then they would actually use the filters and realize that they would have to refresh the screen to actually go back to the instructions. And so we wanted to create a more easy to access way to find these instructions and definitions. And so we just added like an info button that you could access at any point when you were using the map, so you don't have to like refresh everything that you just did. And yeah, in terms of outcomes, I'll give it out to Wilcox again.
So we tested again with the prototype we made, and we used that same system usability score or scale, which measures the effectiveness, intuitiveness, ease of use, and satisfaction, like Luini explained earlier. Asks a few questions, boils it down to numbers. We calculate it. In our second round of testing, the prototype scored 76, which is in the good range, where the first round of testing, based on what we're working with now, was in the poor range. So 32-point difference was pretty substantial, just by addressing, the issues we had raised earlier. But let's talk about what didn't work, because obviously there's still room for improvement with that prototype. Um, What you see here is a heat map. We used Maze, which is a pretty cool platform that you can have users basically do on their own. It will like measure misclicks, time on task, all sorts of different metrics. But what you see in that heat map are where people are clicking. And so obviously this page did not go as planned. What we extrapolated from this was that those color buttons look like checkboxes. And so that was obviously an area that we needed to address and change to make a little more intuitive without having to explain what those were. So another thing that popped up was that users didn't know where to go from the landing page. People tried to interact with the map, and the filter button and map button that we had at the bottom that we had talked about earlier obviously wasn't as intuitive as we had hoped. So those were a couple areas of consideration that we wanted to address and redesign.
Yeah, so I actually forgot to mention this earlier too, is when we made this navigation bar, we were thinking about, having the tutorial also be accessible to the navigation bar. We also thought about if we have and again, we need to talk to activist organizations to really understand what they need, but just thinking about if they're creating maps, maybe for presentations or to put in some kind of document, they might need a way to export the map. So that could be something that could be added. And then we also had a community feature, and the idea here would be maybe for users who aren't activists and don't necessarily know how this zoning map really affects them, and maybe if they want to learn about what's going on in their community, maybe this could be a way to have some kind of platform for activists to post things about what are they doing, how are they using the map to push for zoning reform. So that we could be a way for users to get better informed about how the map is being used. But in our new iterations, since we realized that that navigation bar was really unclear to people, we wanted to make a new design. And what we did is we started actually looking at other zoning maps and try to see what are the standards, what do people expect really when they go into a zoning map. And we noticed that a lot of them, the way that they structured their data logic was to have it separated by layers and then have a separate legend section. And the idea here is that layers is where you manipulate the layers of data, so turning them on and off, and then also manipulating the filters within each layer. And then the legend is where you associate the color with the layer, and then also where you would be able to change and adjust the graphics. And so we have that as a separate category. And this way we actually simplified things so people kind of had a better idea of where to go without having all this whole navigation bar, and then maybe we could still have these features living in the hamburger button at the top. And then this is just showing a before and after of the design. Again, we're switching it to having layers and legend. And again, here you can turn the layers on and off. And here's where you would actually click on these to adjust the colors. And you can actually see which color is associated with which layer on here. And so we did another round of testing with this new design, and we actually brought it up to 84 points, which is great. But there's still improvement to be made. And the biggest thing that we noticed is, again, when we gave them a task for the usability test, essentially we asked users to, I think, turn on primary residential and sewer service areas just to make that comparison of like, okay, where is residential zoning and do we actually have access to sewer services there? And we asked them to also adjust the graphics of those two layers. And so what we noticed with this is that when we asked people to adjust graphics, they were looking for a settings option. They didn't think to go to legend. That wasn't the most intuitive wording. And so I think in the next round, what we would do is actually change that legend to just say settings instead, to make it more clear that that's where you adjust the graphics. Yeah, and so for next steps, we really think that the main thing to do now is really just get in touch with these organizations to see what they need with interviews. Excuse me. And Kenzie's also working on the desktop version now, so we're going to get some prototypes for that. And I think also just doing further accessibility considerations like screen readers for blind people who might need to use the map. And yeah, just thinking about how the website might be a way to educate people on zoning. And also something that Trey brought up is testing if the census and demographic data is actually intuitive for people. But that would be another round of usability testing. But yeah, that is pretty much it. Does have any